pleased to be joined by Gerry Brough, the Director of Place for Bolton Council. Welcome to Downtown in Business, Gerry.
Good afternoon.
Thank you.
Nice to be here.
Yeah, good. And we've got a few people on the call as well. So if you are listening in or watching this, then please do raise your hand or use the chat bar to raise questions, and we can bring you in on the call as we have the conversation about all things Bolton and what's going on there, which I'm interested about. But before we do that, Gerry, I just wanted to talk a little bit about your career. You spent a long time in Regeneration, various different places. Do you want to give us a quick recap of that?
Sure, yeah. Oh, it seems like a long time now, actually. I joined Scottish Enterprise in 1983, and I worked for them for about 17 years. And in that time, I pretty much did most things related to economic development. So I advised companies on startup companies. I helped give out grants to companies. I then got involved in developing sites, brownfield sites particularly for foreign investment. So a lot of American companies, Japanese companies locating in Scotland at the time. And pretty much that got me into property, because I realized that if you're going to convince somebody to locate in a particular location, you had to be able to actually deliver on your promises with regard to the property that they were going to be occupying, or the site that they were to be developing. So I got pretty enmeshed in developing sites and getting these things ready. So I did that until 2020, until the year 2000, not 2020, of course. And in 2000, I left Scottish Enterprise. I actually had spent 18 months prior to leaving Scottish Enterprise on secondment to the government of Kazakhstan as an advisor to their State Committee on Investments, which was really interesting. It was a bit of a freelance contract, really. They came and asked the Scottish Enterprise if somebody could go out and help them. So I stuck my hand up at the time, went out, spent a great 18 months out there, and came back to Scottish Enterprise in 2000. I was asked if I wanted to go out and do another similar contract as a freelancer. So I walked out of Scottish Enterprise basically and into the world of freelance consulting. Yeah. And I did that really for about the best part of 7 years, 6 or 7 years. And then eventually the last contract I did as a freelance was to write a national strategy for the Czech Republic for brownfield regeneration. So that was a reasonably good achievement, which led to quite a number of changes to their planning system, etc. And then DTZ, who were one of the contractors on that project, asked me to join them as a director for their Central Eastern European consultancy division. So I ran that for about 5 years, setting up offices in Kiev, Moscow, Budapest, and a few other locations around Central Europe. And it was all going great until 2008-9, when the financial crash came along. Suddenly there were no customers anymore. I spent about 6 months closing down all the offices I'd opened up in the previous 5 years. And I returned to the UK, and that's when I joined local authorities. I took on a 3-year contract at Aberdeen Council, and that ended up being 4.5 years, actually. I worked there on basically delivering major regeneration projects, so things like the new exhibition and conference centre, offshore wind farm, hydrogen buses, just major infrastructure type projects. Yeah. After 4.5 years and having extended the contract, I felt that was a long enough stint in Aberdeen, and I then moved down to Redcar in Cleveland. I worked for them for 2.5 years as Director of Regeneration, just before the steelworks closed, actually, but there was still a lot to be done there. And then from there, I kind of went back into freelance world and worked as a freelance down in South Oxfordshire, working on the plan for Didcot Garden Town. So I developed that with a large team of fellow consultants, architects, engineers, etc. Did that for 2.5 years. Again, six month contract that ended up 2.5 years. And then at the end of that, moved to Bolton. Again, on the same basis. We've got a huge regeneration plan that we want to implement. We'd like you to consider doing it. and we'll give you a 6-month contract to see how things go. And here I am 3 years later, still working for Bolton Council as their director of place. So I had to come in from the freelance world and become a full-time employee of the council. But it seemed like the logical thing to do, because the regeneration plan in Bolton is such a huge task that it was never going to get done in less than 3 years. So I kind of committed to at least probably the next 2-3 years here to try and get to the point where we've actually started delivering some of these projects, you know. So there you are. Yeah. So I'm an old person, so it takes quite a while to go back through my career.
It's an impressive career, I have to say. It really is, and you've got a major project on there. But before we talk about Bolton's regeneration, what are the main differences? I mean, comparing Eastern Europe predominantly, by the sounds of it, with doing regeneration in the UK, big differences or similarities?
Not really that big differences, I didn't think. I mean, you still have to deal with the politics. They're a bit more complicated in Central Eastern Europe. You have a huge issue around corruption in Central Eastern Europe, but you probably don't have here. I'm saying probably because, you know, I haven't come across it here, put it that way. You know, but the local politics is the same. You've got to deal with national, regional, and local interests. You know, you have to be seen to be doing the right thing for local politicians as well as national politicians. And the projects that I was running were all related to economic development or brownfield development. So, you know, latterly I was pretty much focused on brownfield development, and really that was just about you know, passing on the experience I'd learned while working in the Scottish Enterprise, where we were, you know, at the time regenerating places like Lanarkshire steel mills and Ravenscraig and all this kind of thing. So at the time, I think English estates were also probably one of the world leaders in brownfield regeneration. So the UK was seen as a good source of that kind of expertise. And a lot of the people that worked for me, the team that I had, I mean, I had 32 consultants working on my team, something like 3,500 man days, a contract worth, I think it was worth about €6.5 million over 1 year. So it was a pretty intense, you know, program. But most of them were UK consultants, you know. So a lot of the expertise at that time, I'm going back, you know, several years, 10 years ago or so, but a lot of the expertise at that time was UK expertise. We kind of lost that a wee bit, I think, over the last 10 years. You know, the public sector is not so actively involved in reclamation and regeneration as it once was. So, you know, it's more challenging now, brownfield regeneration in the UK, than I would say it's ever been that I can recall. So, yeah, I didn't see a great deal of difference. Of course, the language is a huge difference. You have to not only put forward your ideas and your expertise, you've got to do it in a different language in some occasions, or through a translator. And that in itself has a whole load of problems, which in terms of communication is quite an interesting experience, and being able to overcome that. So yeah, on a personal front, there's a lot of challenges that you get the chance to deal with and overcome. So it was a good experience, definitely. Yeah.
And the post-Soviet countries, really, so do you see those countries levelling up? You know, I don't know the details, the Czech Republic and things. Are they gradually levelling up with the rest of Western Europe?
I think they've probably slightly overtaken in some respects. I mean, if you look at the Czech Republic and what they've done in brownfield regeneration, I would suggest that they've probably done a bit more than the UK, because, well, we've been pretty much standing still, I think, for a number of years. They've been moving forward with strategies and development plans for some of their major brownfield sites. So I think they have, if you look at Ostrava and Brno and some of the major regeneration schemes in Prague, the centre of Prague, round the river of Vltava, there's some huge regeneration schemes. So they're pretty much, I think, you know, they're probably slightly ahead of us in some respects. They've got a much more coherent, I think, national strategy than we do. I'll not take all the credit for that, but you know, I had a part to play in that for sure.
Yeah.
And I think that's reflected not across the board in Eastern Europe, but in the more progressive countries in Eastern Europe, I would say, you know, they've done pretty well in recent years. Yeah.
That's a really interesting perspective, Gerry, actually, that we don't really often hear about. And perhaps there are even lessons we could learn in the UK from some of the more progressive countries and cities across Eastern Europe now.
Yeah, I mean, I think everybody's moving at different, in different time frames. That's the problem, really, isn't it? The problems that one country are dealing with today are not necessarily the problems that we're dealing with today. And I think they do go to a certain extent in parallel, but they're never quite, exactly the same. So you have to be mindful of that when you go to another country, you're kind of moving into a different part, a different phase, if you like, of the spectrum. But the process, I don't think really should change much from one country to the next. You have a brownfield site, you've got to clear it, you've got to remediate it, you've then got to find a use for that site, and you've then got to attract people into that site to occupy it. It's the same process. And once you know the planning regulations, the planning rules, and they're different from one country to another, but once you know what they are, you have to slot into that process, and basically it then becomes how quickly can you move through that process, and at the end of the day, how good a scheme can you actually put in place that's attractive to the market, because at the end of the day you have to have a market-facing scheme, otherwise it won't work and it won't be sustainable. So I think that's in a lot of walks of life. Skills that you learn during the course of your career are transferable to different locations. You just have to be aware of the different conditions that apply in these locations, and if you're aware of these, then you'll manage okay.
Yeah, good advice as well. Actually, let's talk about Bolton. Major regeneration. I mean, it's not just a relatively small master plan. Lots of intervention areas and wider regeneration way beyond the town centre as well. What's just describe the big picture for Bolton from your perspective?
So the big picture of Bolton is it's quite a sizable borough. A lot of green space, actually majority is green space, a lot of green belt, huge amount of the borough, 25% I think is green belt. We have a number of outlying district centres, Horwich, West Houghton, Farnworth. So around Bolton as a town centre, you've got 4 or 5 districts that have got 25,000 population. Total population of Bolton is nearly 300,000. So it's a sizable town, one of the largest in the UK. And, it's developed in such a way that the older industrial areas, as with a lot of UK cities actually, are mainly towards the centre and the east of the town. The newer industrial areas are all coming on and to the west of the town as you go along the M61 towards Preston. A lot of development along that corridor. Logistics North was a greenfield site 4 or 5 years ago, is now employs 7,500 people in logistics and manufacturing. Some quite advanced manufacturing going on in that site as well. So the west of the borough has become a kind of more residential area. It's closer to the countryside, you might argue. It's topographically, it's flatter and easier to develop, whereas the north of the borough is going up towards the hillier part of the borough, and so more difficult to find sizable sites for development. So a lot of the new developments tended to move out towards the west of the district. And the town centre regeneration plan was really an attempt to redress that, to retain some activity in the town centre, keep the town centre vibrant, and to bring people back into living in the town centre, to make it that more vibrant place and to bring some disposable income into the town. So I don't think that strategy is any different from what most people are now talking about as being a reasonable regeneration strategy. But to be fair to Bolton, they worked on that strategy in 2016-17, and when I came along in 2018, it had already been agreed, it had already been laid out. The council had already borrowed £100 million to help implement that strategy. So, for me, I kind of saw a council that was ambitious, that had allocated the resources necessary to really have a real good go at this. But they weren't entirely focused on the centre of Bolton. They were not Logistics North, as I said, a big development area. There are plans for more developments out in the western part of the town around Wingates. Plans for another 4 million square foot of logistics and manufacturing space there. Currently, a Secretary of State public inquiry, hoping that will go the way of our planning committee who approved it. And in the district centres, in themselves, got their own identity. Horwich, West Houghton see themselves as towns. And to be fair, over a number of years, I've felt a bit forgotten. A lot of the investment and a lot of the attention was in Bolton's town centre, and they wanted a share of the action, as it were. And to be fair, the last administration here in Bolton allocated about £12 million to help fund regeneration plans in the 4 district centres. So I came here to basically, or primarily, to deliver the Bolton Town Centre plan, and ended up with 4 more in our 4 district centres. So we've been working on that for the last couple of years, last 18 months. We've now got these agreed, and we're ready to roll out kind of mini regeneration plans in each of the district centres. So that's, there's been a lot of activity happening, and that's been fueled to a certain extent by things like the Future High Street Fund and the Towns Fund, which the government have released. So we bid for 2 Future High Street Fund schemes. We were successful with one of them in Farnworth. So that's secured £13.3 million for Farnworth Town Centre regeneration. And then we are currently in the process of completing our bid for the Towns Fund, which is £25 million funding, and that will be wholly focused on the town's cultural and civic quarter, really. So we're hopeful we'll get that funding. So that's kind of fueled our activity, as it were. We've been fortunate we had the plan ready, but it's actually been helped in terms of delivering that by the various government schemes that have come along in the last couple of years. So we've not been short of things to do, that's for sure.
Yeah, no, it sounds like it. And just picking up on that point, there's always a big debate in regeneration about whether funds should be allocated on a need basis, or whether there should be competition and bids. I remember being on Blackburn Council many years ago, and a big debate about should we go for SRB, and they just won City Challenge and all the rest of it. Yeah. And as the leader at the time said, that's the only show in town, so that's the game we're going to play. But what's your view? Allocate on the needs basis, or competition drives ambition? Does it?
Allocate on, my view would be allocate on a needs basis, and if they don't use it within a certain time, take it away and give it to somebody else who's able to use it. And the reason I say that is because the whole competition is wasteful of resources, extremely wasteful of resources, and they're getting scarce resources. The time it takes to bid for these schemes, put in the bid, go through the process, find out if you've got the money or not. It's just, I mean, the Housing Infrastructure Fund is a classic example. I think that started, if I remember right, when I was down in South Oxfordshire. You're talking 2016. We only got told in Bolton that they hadn't been successful with the bid about 6 months ago. So it took that long to get to the point where a decision was taken. And in the meantime, Bolton and Wigan, because it was a joint bid, must have expended close to £1 million on consultancy fees putting that bid together for the Housing Infrastructure Fund. New road linking basically linking the M61 to the M6, and opening up about housing along the road, about 20,000 houses. So we weren't successful with that. So that's a huge amount of invested time and effort that's been invested in that particular bid. The same with our Future High Street Fund. We didn't get one of them. We got the other one. The one that we got, we'd been told that everything was going to be carefully assessed on the basis of the submission, and that we're going to pay attention to every area's needs. And then we find out that effectively, when I call round some other directors of place in Greater Manchester, surprise, surprise, we all get 69% of what we asked for. Which kind of makes me think that there hasn't been a lot of science gone into assessing the bids on an individual basis. So, and that's probably just symptomatic of the fact that the Ministry of Housing is under a lot of pressure at the minute, housing, community and local government. And you can see why they would want to simplify the process at their end. But given the amount of effort that we put in at our end, it makes that whole bidding kind of competitive process, I think, not the most efficient way of doing things. So in some cases, yes, but generally speaking, as I said, I'd rather have a kind of needs, and if you don't use it, then we'll give it to somebody else sort of approach.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. And the other new development in terms of bidding for regeneration is the involvement of members of parliament, isn't it? Which I noticed. We're getting overly political, but the government have said, you know, you need to involve MPs in bids and submissions to central government. That's very new, isn't it?
I don't think I can, going back to my Scottish Enterprise days, I can't remember really a bid that we would put in for a major project that wouldn't, you know, that the MP wouldn't know about and wouldn't be briefed on and wouldn't be aware of. You know, and going back to my Lanarkshire days where we had people like John Smith and, you know, Robertson and some of the heavyweight politicians, we met with them every month and we sat down and said, this is what we're doing. So I don't think that's in some areas it might be different, but in my experience, I wouldn't think about doing these things without involving MPs. I think what the government did that's slightly different this time round for the Towns Fund is they insisted that these MPs be part of a steering group or a board. And they insisted that a board or steering group be set up and that be representative of the whole community. And I think that was a good idea. I think it was difficult in the time frame that we were given to do all of that. But we managed to do it. We've got a board, I think about 29 people are on it. You know, it's got GM, it's got the university, it's got our local, our largest housing association. It's got the university, it's got our MPs, it's got only a couple of actual council members on it. It's got the Chamber of Commerce on there. You know, so it's with the Arts Council, it's got Historic England. There's a huge representation on that board of cross-section interests. So in a way, whatever we produce, you know that if it's got the support of that board, it's got wide cross-section support. So that's got to be good and it lends strength to our bid. So I think it's not a bad thing. Yeah, I mean, MPs, I think, should be involved in these things, and they are extremely useful at times. You know, in terms of getting your message across to the right people in government. So I'm all for it.
Yeah, good. That's good. And let's talk about Bolton Town Centre. There are some real gems, some real diamonds in the centre, aren't there? Just off the top of my head, from having worked there, I mean, there's the Octagon Theatre, which we should also talk about. But there's some really beautiful architecture. And I think I'm right in saying the bus terminal and the train terminal sit together, which is not unique, but it's helpful, isn't it, from a regeneration development infrastructure perspective?
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, my predecessors did a real good job because I think it's one of the GM's first transport interchanges that must have been planned in 2015 or thereabouts, and delivered in 2017. And I know that Stockport are looking to do something similar, and it's been great for the town to have the train station, the bus station, all in the same location. It's not been without its problems, in as much as that by relocating the bus station, there were a lot of things that were located close to the old bus station that now feel slightly marooned. And the Bolton Market being the most obvious example of that. So we've still got a bit of work to do to actually kind of rejoin these things up, you know, and that's part of the regeneration plan to make sure that they are connected to each other by you know, good walking cycle ways and all sorts of things. So we're involved in doing that at the minute. But yeah, the transport interchange helps, and it takes you right out into the centre of Bolton. But you're right about Bolton as a town. I mean, I was quite surprised. I think 75% of the town centre is a conservation area. Several conservation areas make up about 75% of the town, which I think is quite unique in a town this size. I don't even think Aberdeen had that, and it had a lot of important buildings, granite buildings, as you'll be aware. So that does preserve quite a lot of the town centre, and does mean that you've got to be a bit sympathetic with some of the developments. Having said that, I've got to say that the council planning department has been extremely flexible and reasonable in the way they approach conservation, to the extent that we have actually demolished some listed buildings as part of our regeneration strategy, mainly because the problem with listed building is it does protect the building, but sometimes it condemns the building to be poorly maintained because the owners of these buildings just can't afford to maintain them as a listed building. And this particular building got into such a bad state that there really wasn't much option other than to demolish it. But in some towns and cities I've been in, you know, you would get quite a lot of opposition to that kind of proposal, and that would cause some difficulties. But in Bolton, everybody's been pretty understanding about these things. So it's a good. I think there's a good reasonableness about Bolton and the way they approach things from the politicians and from the residents. An understanding of the need for change and the need to kind of reinvigorate the town. So I think that's been a cross-party support that the regeneration plan has had from day one. That's helped. I've never really had to. It's never become a political football. We've never had to worry about some of the projects that we're working on becoming political. People using them for political purposes. So that's been a great help, and something you don't always see, I guess, in towns and cities.
And the Octagon Theatre, I've been there in days gone many years ago, days gone by. That's been completely rebuilt. They seem to do it on quite a tight budget as well, but it looks fantastic and 25% bigger.
It is, and they've done a really good job. And it's just unfortunate we've not been able to get inside and make use of it because of COVID pandemic. We were all ready to open in March of last year, and so it's been pretty much standing mothballed for a year. But it is inside. It's a fantastic facility, and outside as well. The council, huge commitment from the council on that scheme, and from the Arts Council. The Arts Council with a £4.5 million grant, and the remainder, nearly £6 million put in by the council, and then the Octagon Theatre themselves raised a substantial amount of money, upwards of £1.5 million to help fund some of the work. So it's been a good kind of joint effort by all the key stakeholders, and we're all desperate just now to get the thing open and start putting on productions again, which following yesterday's announcement looks as if it might be coming in the summertime. So that will be great, because that's not just about the theatre. That's about bringing people into the theatre in an evening, and it's about the evening economy and the nighttime economy, which has suffered really badly over the last 9 months. So our ambition was to bring more kind of restaurants, cafes, and such like into that part of the town centre, and then really that hasn't got off the ground, because the Octagon was the thing that was going to drive that footfall. So I'm looking forward to getting them open and to sort of dusting off our plans and start to speak to some cafes and restaurants that we were speaking to, a year ago about potentially locating in Bolton, and all that has been put on hold. So it'll be quite nice to reinitiate these conversations and see what we can do in terms of getting people into that part of the town centre. I've got to say that I mentioned the Towns Fund and the £25 million that we are bidding for that. One of the key projects in that bid is to develop the Wellsprings building, which is right next door to the Octagon. And our plans for that building are to create state-of-the-art, high-tech business incubation space, similar to a building called the Landings in Salford, which we were quite impressed with what they've done there. So the plan is to do something similar right in the centre of Bolton. I think once we've got that, and right next door to the Octagon, Eric Wright Group are making substantial investments now in Newport Street. So that whole kind of part of the town centre is going to become much improved actually in the next 6 to 9 months. So a lot of work around public realm in that area as well. So I'm quite looking forward to late summer actually, when a lot of these things will start to happen. It's been a shame that they've been put off for the last year.
And you touched upon this earlier, Gerry, the idea of increasing residential within the town centre, not unusual in places like Manchester, and the changing nature of retail going online and things. High streets changing dramatically. What's the agenda there for Bolton? You need to, as you do in most town centres, I presume, you need to shrink the town centre somewhat. It can't be as vast.
Well, the regeneration plan allowed for that. I mean, Crompton Place is just under 400,000 square foot of retail space. When we purchased that, we purchased it with the aim of demolishing it and replacing it with a new development. And that new development will not have much more than 100,000 square foot of retail space. We'll be taking about 300,000 square foot of retail space out of the town centre. Hopefully that will, that still leaves us actually, believe it or not, with a bit of a surplus of space. Probably we could do with taking another 100,000 square foot out somewhere. But that will leave the town centre in a much better position, and the existing and other retail in other parts of the town centre will now start to flourish, I think, because you know, there'll be more demand for the units that are currently vacant. Who knows what's going to happen post-COVID as to what that will do. So therefore, as I say, probably could do with taking a bit more space out. I think that will happen because our other shopping centre, the marketplace, has been hit badly by the closure of you know, Arcadia, and you know, the Zara have announced that they're moving out. So they've been, Debenhams closure, of course, so they've been quite badly hit by what's going on in the retail industry. And I wouldn't be surprised if Moorgarth, who are the owners of that centre, look to design that to some extent, maybe bring in some office space. Who knows, possibly even some residential, I don't know, but it's likely, I would think, that the mix of that shopping centre will have to change. So I think we've almost planned for all of that. You know, the residential, I think there are currently about 1,200 residential units in the town centre. At the moment, we're planning to increase that to over 4,000. I've got to say, however, that might drop slightly. And the reason for that is entirely, I think, down to COVID, because schemes that we previously were thinking would be apartments are now being redesigned as townhouses, because the developers are kind of concerned about, you know, the commitment it takes to put apartment blocks up and to get them let, and you know, the uncertainty, I think, amongst investors, you know, getting involved in these kind of schemes in Bolton, for example, rather than the centre of Manchester. So I think that you know, they're reverting to a more safer model, and that involves, you know, family townhouses basically. So that might reduce the number of units eventually that are in the town centre. But I've got no doubt there will be well over 2,500 new units in the town centre, and actually it'll probably be a broader mix now of people because of the replacement of some apartment developments with townhouse developments. So it should actually, you know, add to the economic disposable income that's available in the town centre for retailers and the hospitality industry to benefit from, hopefully. So I mean, that's the aim of it. You don't move people in just to move people in. You aim to do that because they've got some spending power, and that will you know, invigorate the businesses in the town centre. So you know, that's not going to happen overnight, because to get to that number, it's going to be 2, 3, 4 years from now. But I've got, you know, pretty confident that in 4 or 5 years from now, Bolton Town Centre will be much more vigorous than it is now, and more vibrant, and a better mixed community. So I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah, I'm going to bring in one of our observers in a moment, David Sleeth, to ask a question. But before I do, just I suspect that the further and higher education have a role to play in terms of the town centre, from my recollection, around Bolton, the college and Bolton Institute as well. They bring a lot of students in, presumably. Yeah,
well, again, we're lucky that we're one of Bolton University is one, I think, 5 universities in Greater Manchester. And having a university in your town, it clearly gives you a huge advantage in terms of economic development. And if that university gets their curriculum right, it can have an even better impact. I know this from personal experience, because I was born in Dundee, as you can tell from the accent. I'm Scottish. I was born in Dundee, and Dundee University and Abertay University have done wonders over the last 15 years in terms of, you know, niche roles in forensic science and in gaming and so on, to the extent that it's been a major driver of the economy. And I think Bolton University has the potential to do the same, because by good luck or judgment, you never know with these things, but the courses that they provide, nursing, for example, one of the premier locations for doing a nursing degree in the UK now. I was speaking to the Vice Chancellor the other day, and he was saying that they're fully booked out next year. They'll be putting through 500. There'll be 500 nurses per year going through their courses to get qualified. They don't do dentistry in Bolton, but they do dental technician degree, and that's in huge demand as well. And that spins off a lot of dental technology companies in Bolton, providing dental implants and such like. So the university have got a really good motor sports kind of engineering type faculty, and also gaming faculty. They do a lot of work with Sony and a lot of work with some film production companies. So I think if they've got that kind of mix, that these are very practical courses, and that's the type of course that a lot of students want to enroll on now. So they were telling me the other day that their prognosis next year is looking pretty healthy compared to a lot of universities in terms of their student numbers and the fact that they've been able to put a lot of these courses out remotely. So I think that it looks reasonably good for Bolton University, although you have to have a worry for the university sector as a whole, and Bolton won't be immune to that. But you would think that they've got the resilience because of the courses they deliver to still be quite a solid base on which to build the local economy. So yeah, it's a great asset to have.
Yeah, no, that's good. Thanks, Gerry. And David, could you just a brief introduction to yourself and do pose your question? We can have a conversation about it.
Hi, Gerry. Good afternoon. Thanks, Simon. David Sleeth, Managing Director of Appy Holdings. We're a new company in the MMC sector. And I just wondered, Gerry, if there are any plans as a town for accelerating adoption of MMC for the delivery of housing, and if so, what are the mechanisms by which we might get involved? Okay,
I'm a great believer in modern methods of construction, and the reason I am is because I got immersed in it while I was doing the plans for Danczuk Garden Town. If you're developing a garden town and you're looking 10 years ahead, you really need to be thinking about modern methods of construction as being one of the primary ways of building new units, new residential units particularly. So I kind of got immersed in that really over the last few years, and it's something that I'm a real big advocate of. The situation in Bolton, however, is complicated because we don't own any stock as a council. The stock of houses in Bolton was transferred to Bolton at Home. They're the biggest registered provider in Bolton. There are actually about 7 or 8 registered providers who operate in Bolton in some significant way. But Bolton are the largest with about 48,000 houses. And they are currently working, I think, on about 3 or 4 developments in Bolton, in the town centre, but also in Farnworth and some of the districts like West Houghton. So we have got little or no influence on how they go about building their houses. We give them some grant now and again, and sometimes we make our sites available for their development. But we're limited as to what control we can have on the actual development process. And in discussions with them, they are actually building houses in Farnworth using MMC, and they're doing it through Allocation homes who are supplying the kits for them, and I think they've got a couple of other schemes that they've got in mind using modular housing. But so we work with them. We work with the development director. We encourage them through our planning to look at this as a mechanism. The conversations I've had with them tend to be, however, that they're not quite sure yet whether or not it's financially viable for them to do this. They all know that in the long term, and this is actually the position I've found most house builders, they all know that in the long term it's going to be something that's going to happen and going to become more prevalent. It's a bit like electric cars and the journey that they've been on for the last 10 years. Everybody knew they were coming, but none of the major manufacturers really wanted to make that commitment until somebody came in and basically, disrupted the market. In cars, it was Tesla that did it. There hasn't really been anybody in the UK that has disrupted the market in that way. And partly that's because, of course, the land is controlled by most of the major developers who have the land banks. I guess the biggest hope I've seen in the last few years was was Urban Splash's tie-up with I can't remember the name of the Japanese company, but the biggest Japanese.
Sekisui House.
Yeah, exactly. So I kind of thought that was maybe had the potential to be a major disruptor in the UK industry. I know that Wimpey have got their homes for 2000, I think Vision 2020, I think they call it, or it was 2020, maybe 2030 now. So I know they were looking at different forms of modular construction and trying to work out which was the best for them. And I do think they might have introduced it in some of their sites. But there's not been a wholesale move by the large house builders into MMC. And I think until that happens, it's always going to be difficult. And the reason being, because one of the other projects I worked on while I was in Didcot Garden Town was we did have a manufacturer who wanted to build a 100,000 square foot factory to build modular units. And they were telling me they needed 7,000 to 8,000 units going through that factory every year to make it profitable. And, you know, so the question was, who's going to give them an order book of 78,000 units? Now, I might have thought, and you might have thought, that the logical people to do that were Homes England. But it hasn't transpired. They have put a lot of MMC builders onto their, their tender, their list for subcontractors. But I don't see anything that says, you know, we are going to start building using modular construction on some major sites around the country. And again, until that happens, I'm not really sure. I think you've got a challenge on your hand because there's a number of systems out there, isn't there, as well? There's light steel, you know, there's SIPs, there's a timber frame. So when you talk about MMC, you talk about quite a number of potential systems out there. And again, nobody's quite sure what's the one that's going to be the primary one. I mean, I was surprised when I came down to England and I talked about modern methods of construction, and I talked about timber framed, and people would say, "Well, we don't build timber frame in England. That's just not happening." You know, I'm thinking I've never lived in a house that isn't timber framed since I bought my first house in 1980. Because in Scotland, all houses since about 1980 are timber framed. You'll struggle to find a traditional built house in Scotland. So Bellway, you know, so the funny thing is Bellway, Wimpey, Barratt, all these guys build timber frame houses in Scotland, but they don't, generally speaking, down in England. And they'll tell you it's because the market in England is, you know, people want traditional built houses. Well, that's a marketing issue for me. It's not a, you know, you get good traditional built houses, you get bad traditional built houses, the same as you get good and bad MMC houses. So it's a marketing issue. You've got to convince people that the MMC is as good as traditional, in some cases a lot better from an energy point of view, for example. So I think the industry as a whole has got a lot to do. They've gone some way towards helping that by putting in place schemes through 60-year life cycle schemes, which I think is better than the National House Building Scheme, for example, because it gives you a quality mark over the whole process, you know, from raw material through to completion, whereas the NHBC is simply about, you know, the build on site. It doesn't actually go into the materials go into that build. So, you know, I do think that there's that MNC have come a long way in the last 3 or 4 years, but it needs a major push. And it's funny because the government have really bought into MMC with regard to school provision, for example. In the Department of Education, pretty much all of the schools that they're building now or funding are done using off-site modular construction. You know, so on one hand, you've got the government kind of seeing the advantages of that type of construction, but in the house building sector and through Homes England, you don't seem to see a kind of major commitment that I might have expected. So a long way to say that Bolton Council is probably a pretty insignificant player in all of this. I will, and my planners will try to encourage developers, but we've pretty much dispose of sites on option agreements to developers, make sure that it's a high quality, sustainable development, but leave the developer to determine what method of construction they use. And so we're not in a position to be a major influencer on that, I don't think, in Bolton. Sorry, a very, very long answer, but
No, thank you very
you
much.
got me on one of my pet subjects. So,
Yeah, it's a good, fascinating discussion, actually. I really enjoyed that. Thanks for posing the question, David. And if there's any other participants that want to ask a question before we reach the top of the hour, then please do indicate. Gerry, I just wanted to ask you about Bolton's role within Greater Manchester, because there's clearly a connection there, isn't there? It's all part of the same conurbation, really. And it has to connect with Manchester itself. I presume a fair proportion of people from Bolton work in Manchester and then come back home again. How does all that work? What's the vision there?
I think since coming to Manchester, I've been quite pleased and to a certain extent surprised that there's a huge cohesiveness about Greater Manchester. It was the first kind of combined authority, and you can tell that actually when you go into meetings, people have been used to working together for quite a long period of time. So there's a lot of give and take, which is what you need in a partnership with 10 local authorities, and so that has been not entirely surprised, but it's been nice to come into that kind of working atmosphere. As I said, we're generally pretty constructive. Directors of place meet regularly, as do all the other directors, and the chief execs obviously meet on a regular basis. It's not without its difficulties. We've had one recently with the spatial framework where Stockport decided not to support their particular submission as part of that wider framework. And as a result, we're now moving forward with a plan of 9 local authorities and without Stockport, which in a way quite shows that we have got that ability to adapt. If we do get to a point that proves to be a real sticking point, it's not necessarily all or nothing. There is an ability for councils to operate individually or operate as a smaller group. So it's been quite flexible in that respect. Politically, it's possibly a bit more challenging for Bolton. We're now the only Conservative-controlled authority in Greater Manchester. One of the few in the north of the country, I think, and so that's inevitably not going to be without its tensions at a political kind of level. But I've got to say that I haven't noticed that affecting anything that we do, in terms of our programmes or projects or the collaboration that we have. There was a bit of a difference of opinion around some of the early COVID, restrictions and such like, where Bolton was really badly hit by them early on, and I think we were put into lockdown when the cases got to be more than 200 per 100,000 of population. I think we felt at the time that was a bit severe, and we've never really come out of lockdown, to be honest. Bolton has been, one of the worst affected towns in the country. Our hospitality industry has been particularly badly hit. So, that's where you do get, I guess, inevitably some tension politically, between the mayor and some of our administration politicians, but it hasn't really had a huge impact on what we as officers do. It's certainly not had any impact on my area of activities, but there are some big issues that we're dealing with around clean air, for example. The GM plans to take over the bus services, and so on. So these are big contentious issues: taxi licensing, minimum standards for taxi licensing. So on a GM-wide basis, they're dealing with some really pretty big issues at the minute. The spatial plan I mentioned already, and generally speaking, the 10 local authorities have held together on all of these issues, and these are the sort of issues that would test any politicians or any local authorities. So you've got to complement the way that the leaders in Manchester work together, and genuinely have an interest in making sure everybody in Manchester shares in things and works together to get the best for Manchester as a place rather than for their individual boroughs. So I found it a really useful, I was going to say organisation, but collaborating is probably the best way of putting it, and it certainly simplifies your route to government if you've got a channel that you can go through the combined authority, because you've got to ask yourself whether or not we'd have the same access to government if we didn't have a GM authority batting for us. And I think the answer to that is probably no. We wouldn't have the same weight when we go to government. So I've not seen anything overly negative about the whole GM setup. I've just seen positives, I've got to be honest.
Yeah, that's good. And just to summarise in terms of Bolton and the economy and moving forward post pandemic, it's going to be tough, is it? Or what's your summary of moving? You're a glass half full person, are you? Or?
I'm always, you can't be, I've always said you can't be in regeneration without being an optimist. It's just physically, it's just impossible. If you were, you go mad. So you've got to think that things are going to get better and that what you're doing is going to add to that improvement or help that improvement. So I think that there's no doubt about it that COVID has had a huge impact. It slowed everything down. It's created a whole load of uncertainty, in the regeneration development sphere. Investors are nervous, not quite sure where rents are going, where values are going, not sure what's happening with the office market, the resident, the retail market. So there's a lot of uncertainty out there, which will add to that kind of slowing things down, because people want to just take stock, let things settle down before they start making kind of big decisions. I think once we get through that period of uncertainty and people are convinced that we're heading towards a kind of more normal situation, then I've got to think, looking back my experience, probably 3 or 4 recessions I've seen, then there's a potential for it to really come back strong. And the optimist in me tells me that Bolton has timed it perfectly. not as I say, by a lot more than judgment, I suspect. But we didn't have any of our schemes underway at the time when COVID came along. They were all pretty much just at the planning and funding stage. They've been delayed because of that kind of uncertainty around funding. But once that comes back into play, and once we get these schemes moving, then we're going to be delivering kind of new product in 2024, probably. And that's when I think the market will be back, hopefully at its strongest, and where there'll be a demand for new residential units. There'll be a demand for new office units, because people will realise that the current offices they're in are older and they're not capable of providing the kind of environment that they want for staff now, with a bit more space, a bit more communal facilities, etc., and the ability to be flexible in terms of home working. So they'll be looking for a different type of office space. Retail will have changed, and they'll be looking for something different in that sphere. And we will be bringing product into the marketplace, having taken account of some of the lessons we've learned from COVID. So all the developers are looking at their schemes and saying, well, what can we do to improve the schemes? What can we do to make them feel safer should we end up with another pandemic, and goodness knows when, hopefully never. But they're all taking these, redesigning things, just making improvements. And so therefore we'll come back strong with some really good product, I suspect. So that's kind of me being optimistic. I think that the future is pretty good for Bolton. I don't believe that the town centres are dead and that they're ended. Bolton has lived with Middlebrook, one of the largest out-of-town shopping centres in Europe, on its doorstep for the last 10 years, and the town centre survived. So there's no reason why it can't survive into the future if we get this mix of development right. And as I say, we're probably, the timing isn't bad from our point of view. So, there's a lot to be optimistic about, I think, in Bolton. And, I'm just hopeful that we can deliver and that we have the resources to be able to deliver, because there's no doubt that from an organisational point of view, COVID has hit the council badly in terms of its own finances. And therefore, that is going to be a constraint on what we may or may not be able to do, because our capacity as a team is probably going to be less as we go forward rather than more. So, accepting that is likely to be the case. I'm hopeful that we can still, nevertheless, we've got to the point where our schemes are building up a momentum of their own, and they can come forward strong. So 22, 23, 24 should be, I think, a good time to be in Bolton, hopefully.
Well, Gerry, before I let you go, just it sounds like you've got a couple more years to do in Bolton. But tell me, just share with us what you do when you're not regenerating town centres and the wider economy. What do you do in your spare time?
Well, I was laughing before we came on when you asked me this, because I said I'm moving from one room to the other at the minute. You know, it seems like you're on holiday if you move from one room to the other. But seriously, no, I was a great golfer. I used to play a lot of golf. I got out of the way of it when I went abroad because it wasn't so easy to find golf courses in places like Kazakhstan and Prague and so on, not unless you're prepared to spend a lot of money. So I'm you know, I've come back here now. I play a bit of golf. I do a lot of walking. My wife and our kids are both through university, married with their own families. So that's why over the last 6 years or so, we've become a bit of an itinerant as a couple. We've kind of moved around the country. We've stayed in a lot of different places. It's been great. It's funny because we've almost done what our kids would be expected to do now that they've left the house. So we've had a good time traveling around the UK, staying in different locations. And, you know, in that time, as I say, it probably means you can't join clubs if you're moving every couple of years. It's difficult to be, I'm not a sort of a clubbable sort of person. So I go and I play golf and I pay my dues and buy the round, and I meet up with some friends because a lot of Scottish friends who are great golfers. And we go for walks at the weekend. I don't do as much exercise as I should do. I'm sure of that. I'd like to say that I went to the gym, but I don't. I'd like to say that, you know, I was a great rugby player in my day, but again, I don't really have any involvement in youth rugby or anything like that, sadly. But, you know, once I get through this Bolton challenge, then I'm hoping that I've got plenty of time to still get involved and pick up on some of these hobbies that I used to do and restart them. So I'm going to, I'll make a concerted effort to get my handicap down again once and if I ever retire, that is. We'll see what happens in a year's time.
Thank you. Let me finish by saying that Downtown in Business have got a national planning and regeneration conference at the Belfry Hotel in September this year. So I hope both yourself and participants in this discussion will be able to make that. It's been an absolute delight, Gerry, to have you join us. I found the conversation fascinating, absolutely fascinating. So thank you very much, and thank you for all those that have joined us. Thanks.
Welcome, Simon.
If you enjoyed that video, then please subscribe to our YouTube channel on the link below and be among the first to get to listen to all the latest interviews through the Downtown Den.